Welcome to the Capital Forum's interview series. My name is Sally Hubbard, and we are delighted to have Elai Katz here with us today. As background, Elai is a partner at Cahill, where he leads the firm's antitrust practice group. And with that, let's go ahead and jump in. So Elai, how helpful are the 2010 merger guidelines to businesses, investors, and the general public in helping to decide in advance whether a merger will be challenged?
Well, they are helpful, and first of all, thank you for having me. They are very helpful, but there also are some criticisms that I have about them. First, I'd want to say that we should think about what the purpose is of guidelines such as these. And they have multiple purposes for multiple constituencies. One of the purposes is for practitioners and economists, people who are experts in antitrust law. I don't want to talk about that now. They're very helpful for those people who know what the agencies have been doing, and it's useful for them to see a written document describing what the agencies have been doing. But what I want to talk about in an area that I spend a lot of time in my practice thinking about is how do business people and then how do courts look at the guidelines, how are they helpful? And they're helpful, but many of the ways that they're helpful are the same ways that the 1992 guidelines were helpful. And so in that respect, the changes, some of the changes are very helpful to the business community, but some of the changes are less helpful. And so to give one example, one of the main points of discussion or controversy when the 2010 guidelines came out was the idea of the de-emphasis of the importance of defining a relevant market, that structural analysis. And I think it turns out that although that is it's an important thing to say, that that's not the only way that mergers are analyzed, that the agencies may go about it in a different way or in a different order. And nonetheless, for courts, for business people, it is actually very useful to use the traditional structural analysis to think, what is the relevant market here? Even if it is more of a general contours kind of relevant market definition rather than a strict, sort of robust economic model of what the market is and what is the concentration. Those kinds of questions remain useful. So the guidelines are very useful, but some of what's useful about them is the same thing that was useful about the 1992 guidelines.
So you think the kind of de-emphasis on defining the market and doing the structural analysis actually weakens the predictive value of the guidelines, or it makes it harder to predict if you're doing that type of analysis?
I suppose the answer is yes and no. It is less useful the more different tools are thrown in that may be used. It's a little bit harder to predict. However, I'm not entirely critical of it, because it is, of course, useful to know what tools are actually going to be used. And I think it's always important to note that there are two very different steps in our merger analysis, in American U.S. merger analysis as compared to European or other countries, where we have an agency process. It is very much an administrative process, but ultimately, if an agreement can't be reached, a merger can't be blocked in this country without going to a judge, a generalist judge, who needs to be persuaded that this merger should be blocked. And that's very different than in other places. And so with that in mind, there are two different things that people who are trying to predict how a merger is going to go forward. Let's say a business that is trying to sell itself or one of its units, and they have several bidders, and they're trying to decide amongst the different bidders which one will raise the least antitrust risk as compared to how much they're prepared to pay. And they have limited information because they don't have all the information of the various bidders and their pricing policies and all of that. So they need to make some predictions that are more closer to back of the envelope predictions than the kinds of things that perhaps an economist at the Department of Justice or FTC could do after they've received many gigabytes of data downloaded through a second request process. So useful to know what happens at the agencies, but to some extent it could be less useful in the sense that there's some analysis described in the guidelines that can't be done. It can't be performed with too much precision in advance, and by the courts, even if they hear some of that evidence. If it's not a step-by-step analysis with presumptions, the way that courts are used to thinking about things, about legal questions generally, then for them too, it is less useful. But by that I don't mean to say that some of the let's say the UPP analysis, the kind of analysis about unilateral effects, shouldn't be in there. It's just that it should be viewed. It has a different purpose.
And what would that purpose be?
The purpose is to have a written document explaining what the agencies do inside the administrative process,
Okay.
And it is useful to know what that is. But as far as one's ability to predict if you're an investor, if you are thinking of providing financing to a merger, or if you are considering early on in the process, with whom do you want to consider contracting to enter into an agreement, then the older structural kind of process that is described both in 1992 and in 2010 turns out to be more helpful with some of the tweaks that I think are present there. For example, discussion about mavericks are important and useful and make sense and can be undertaken by businesses, by investors, by judges. I think there's a common sense appeal there. The notion of head-to-head competition, closest competitors, those are notions that have been brought out nicely in the 2010 guidelines and are very helpful in the predictive aspect of the guidelines, which I think is a useful. I believe that's one of the things that the guidelines are meant to do, is to allow the business community to know to make good judgments about which mergers are going to be challenged and which ones won't be challenged.
And so, in terms of the helpfulness of the merger guidelines to the courts, I mean, there's a little bit of a disjunct there, right? And because there's the process that the agencies use, and then there's the court precedent that the courts are still continuing to follow, but that seems to be changing a little bit in some recent cases. I mean, what do you think about
Yeah, well,
that?
I'm glad you raised the recent cases. I think the one most interesting to look at is the Bazaar Voice case. In the Bazaar Voice case, as you know, has to do with ratings and reviews, online ratings and reviews of products. The merger was a non-reportable merger that was closed and investigated, and the Department of Justice brought a case. The judge ruled in favor of the Department of Justice. And what's interesting there is when you look at the Department of Justice's complaint and their presentation of the case, for the most part, they did go about it not too much with the traditional, this is the market, these are the market shares. It wasn't too structural. But as I understand it, when they presented their case in court at trial, they, of course, to be safe, they made that kind of presentation as well. And then when the judge sat down to write his decision, I found very interesting that he said, he sidestepped the issue. He said, I don't have to decide here about this debate of whether you do or don't need to define a relevant market and calculate their market shares and look at concentration, because I find that the government succeeded in persuading me that their relevant market, a relatively narrow one of online ratings and reviews, that he found that was a legitimate relevant market. He found that in that market there were very few competitors and there was not ease of entry. So he went about a structural analysis. He found that the 2010 merger guidelines, support that kind of analysis, and he avoided the decision. So the way I see it, certainly in that jurisdiction, in the Northern District of California, the law remains as it has been. So even though the 2010 guidelines were cited with approval, the law, as I see it, remains as it's been for many years, that under Section 7 of the Clayton Act, you're expected to define a market, go through a structural analysis, that there are some presumptions, rebuttable presumptions that come about if you find a highly concentrated market where the concentration is increasing. And so I think the lesson from that is what I've been talking about, that yes, there are these other tools. Yes, the government may think about a merger in those ways, and it is very helpful for the world to be aware of that. But when push comes to shove, when a court needs to decide, I think it appeals to them to have a step-by-step process. It appeals to them to have presumptions, and that continues to work. And I think in many cases, it turns out to be the result isn't all that different, whichever method you approach it.
All right. Well, thanks again, Eli, for chatting with me today, and we hope we can do it again soon.
Thank you very much.